The Purple Butterfly Healing Center proudly presents Let's Play Canada, a listening series that aims to give voice to child and play therapists, supervisors, interns, and all lovers of play. May the therapeutic powers of play be elevated here in Canada by highlighting voices and promoting connection across the country. Telling our stories and hearing the stories of others stitches together a collective narrative of the healing landscape across our great country. I am Billie-Jo Bennett, registered social worker and Canadian play therapy supervisor, owner and clinical director of the Purple Butterfly Healing Center in Cambridge, Ontario. Our first series, which I am so very pleased to bring to your listening ears, is our Living Legend series, focusing on play therapy experts across Canada.
Okay, well, welcome to Let's Play Canada. We're here today with Theresa Fraser. She is play therapy supervisor, owner, and founder of Maritime Play Therapy Center in Nova Scotia and Changing Steps in PEI and Ontario. Welcome, Theresa. Thank you so much for taking part in this podcast interview today. It's so good to talk with you, and
we can chit chat, have a
conversation. Yeah. So I wondered maybe we could start with, you've got a lot going on out there in Nova Scotia. I know that you moved there, I don't know, was it several years ago?
Yeah, it's coming up to 5 years. Just 5 years, actually. I think,
wow,
oh my gosh, it's 5 years. And then it's like, oh, it's only 5 years. Right. Yeah, it's only been 5 years. But of course we came like right before COVID hit too, right? And
I see.
Yeah, I moved. I was a full-time professor, and people were like, why are you leaving your full-time professor job and part-time therapist job? And for a lot of reasons, for my family, we decided that it would be a good move. And in my head, I'm like, I'm blessed. Like in play therapy, we can work anywhere as long as you're licensed. So I got licensed before I came here, and then and I was hired initially by the local health authority because they wanted play therapy, but they didn't really understand what would be required to do that. So eventually I ended up going into private practice because I was initially doing seeing littles in schools. And then I realized, you can't see 13 kids in a day at a school and be doing therapy. You can be doing triage, but you're not doing therapy. So I did full-time private practice, and just also around the same time when I was trying to find play therapists in the community, I realized, and to be honest, I felt kind of silly afterwards because I should have known, because I had been president of the association, then became president again during COVID. But I could have looked and went, oh my gosh, there aren't people there. And it didn't quite dawn on me, right? Because I remember being in a certain place and someone saying, oh, you have to connect with so-and-so, they're the play therapist. And I was like, yay, I found my people. And then I talked to the person, and they'd done a workshop, right? And they had toys in their office. And I actually had a couple of years ago, PEI is a really interesting province in that you can get there by where I live. There's a ferry that goes right to the island. So, an hour on the ferry and an hour of driving, and I'm at my office in Charlottetown. But the ferry only runs from May to December. And then you have to drive around, which means you drive through Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and then one end of the island to the other. So it's a little bit of a trek. It's
a longer commute.
Yeah. And I was coming back one night, and it must have been like 11 o'clock at night by the time I hit. There's like tolls when you go from one province to the other. And I'm not kidding. There was a car in front, and it was summertime. It was wild. Oh, I know. I missed the ferry. So I had to drive because it was summertime, because it was a station wagon, 2 cars ahead of me with bikes and all sorts of, like, they were clearly going camping, but there's a bumper sticker on it that says, I love play therapy. And I was like, what? Oh my gosh, my people. But it was a Massachusetts license plate. So I'm yelling at the toll booth, I'm a play therapist. And my friend who's with me is like, you are so wackadoodle. I was like, no, like you don't see those bumper stickers. It was so funny. But yeah, so I got here, and there weren't any other Canadian play therapists certified at the time. There was one almost in the process. There was one in the process in PEI, and one in the process in New Brunswick. So I had been an approved provider of training when I was in Ontario, but I only did continuing ed training because the Canadian Association for Play Therapy program is the best. Like, you don't want to compete with that.
Right.
But when I did some investigating when I got here, the reason we didn't have a lot of people in, Newfoundland, PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia was because the training model is, full days, 2 weeks in May, 2 weeks in June, 2 weeks in July. Now it's August. But because the maritime provinces are very top down in terms of government dictates a lot,
Oh, I see.
people you'd have to take vacation to do your training and they wouldn't pay for it because it wasn't CBT and it wasn't DBT.
Mm,
So that meant people couldn't do it, right?
I
They're
see.
going to take 3 years of their family vacation. And the salaries here, quite frankly, it's a very different remuneration than it is in Ontario and other provinces.
Mhm.
So it became really clear to me that it's not accessible. And that's what the barrier was. So I connected with the Canadian Association and said, I'm only going to be providing therapy for Maritimers and or training for Maritimers. And that was kind of how it started. And we have usually small cohorts, like there's 8 or 9 people per year, which is great.
Mhm.
And the model was that it would be one Saturday a month from September to June for 3 years. So it didn't interfere with people's work life.
Wow.
And then that's really kind of how we've grown it out here. And then when COVID hit, we moved it to Thursday evenings because people didn't have to drive. Because that was my other worry in the winter, like Cape Breton, which is obviously part of Nova Scotia, but it's also often referred to as the island, and Nova Scotia, the mainland. In the wintertime, like it can get pretty bad very quickly here. So people were really worried about, I'm going to miss my training dates. So once we were able to go to Zoom, it just made it way more accessible for people. So we now there's a way larger presence. And now what we're battling here, which is not unlike other provinces in Canada, like I had one of my graduates who's certified now, she was like, I was at a family circle working in a First Nations community, and the social workers were like, well, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so is saying they're a play therapist, but they're like, are they? And she said, and I felt really icky to go, I'm not familiar with these names. And I was like, yeah, because now what's happening, just like it happened in Cambridge, when I lived in Cambridge, where you are, I was the only clinic that was doing play therapy. Well, now there's lots of people. So I think when play therapists across Canada, whatever community we're in, when people see the good work that's happening, they're like, oh, I want that for my client or my child or my grandchild. And it grows the profession very quickly because every one of us we're doing wonderful work with the therapeutic powers of play. And the same thing has happened here now, that now people will say, oh, do you do play therapy? And they're like, oh yeah, I do play therapy. Yeah. So during Play Therapy Week, which was so exciting that Canada had their first Play Therapy Week, and you were on the committee with me and some other amazing folks to be promoting play therapy, not only in Canada, but with International Play Therapy Week. One of the things we did out here is we had a Zoom panel discussion on what is play therapy and what is certification. Nice. And I invited all the therapists that I knew to invite any referring agents they have to say, come and hear, just so we could start to empower referral agents to be able to ask questions.
Right.
And another thing I've requested of our national association, which has never happened before, but I've asked, could we consider putting the names of people that have taken training and are working on certification on the website, as long as they're connected with a supervisor? So they're connected with a supervisor and they're getting support. And then at least we can refer people anywhere across Canada to say, check the Canadian Association for Play Therapy website, and then they'll know, who's who. And then the other thing we did is I created a table for my training institute, listing, with permission, obviously, who's done what training and where they're located and what their specialties are in the province. Because there are people like you that also incorporate EMDR with play therapy, or other in like safe and sound protocol or other interventions. And we're just sending that out to any referring agent we can find to say, here are the people, just so people know
that's so
who's
great.
who. And it's growing because, again, of the good work of play therapists that are listening.
So since you started your center out there, your training center, Theresa, how many play therapy people have you trained?
Oh, I think we had a graduation tea.
I remember seeing the photos. Yeah.
So cute. It's like like you can bring your hats and we'll have a tea. It was like the first time since COVID we could really get together. And I think for the first 2 years we had 13 people that went through. So, small
Amazing.
groups, but planting seeds everywhere.
Well,
And
it is. That's what it is. Planting
yeah.
seeds. Mhm.
And I think I probably have another 13 in progress now.
Oh my
So,
gosh, that's amazing.
yeah, it's really exciting. And it's not me doing, even though I'm the supervisor and I'm hosting the training, I bring in other guest trainers to do
Right.
bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Because the other question that often comes up, and you probably get this too, is especially with COVID, so many American trainers are providing training, and it's more accessible to us than ever before because we don't have to get on a plane, and it's way more affordable. So there's lots of training that's available, but so I'll often hear from people, well, how come that can't count for foundation training? And I go, well, because they're not Canadian. Like it may be offered in Canada, in Toronto or Edmonton or wherever, but there has to be a Canadian play therapy supervisor sponsoring and in tandem and co-presenting. And I really fear that if we don't stick to those standards, we run the risk of losing our Canadian program,
Right.
Which understands the culture of Canada, and the content that's required, because we are very different than the US in some ways.
Yes.
I know every community, oh my gosh, from working in, I spent the early part of my child welfare career in Edmonton, and then, was from Ontario. So we then lived in Ontario, and then even here, and every part of our country is very distinct.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And even including our First Nations communities, like every community is very different. So I'm a passionate lifelong learner. So I'm always learning and trying to learn more, but I'm also fiercely protective of our Canadian Association.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I think that's really, really, really important for sure. Canadians are pretty special people, and Canadian play therapists are pretty miraculous. So
I agree.
You mentioned a career in child welfare, but what I'm wondering is, can we back up and well, I mean, maybe that's where it's all started. I don't know, but my question is about your career and your influences in becoming or falling in love with really a play therapist.
It's a story. So it kind of even starts earlier. So when I was little, like my sister and I, our parents were really, really young, and they were like 18 when they had me. So they were really, really young. And at one point my mother was really ill, and my sister and I ended up in foster care together. Okay. And then eventually we went back home when my mother was healthy, and my dad was he was working. And I said to him later, I was like, how come we didn't go to family? And he said, everybody was working. Like there wasn't anybody to help us, that could help us. So, we went into foster care for a short period of time. And I do remember going and seeing a psychiatrist at one point, who, for whatever reason, who had toys in his office, and he wasn't a play therapist, but I was like, oh, that was interesting. And then when I was in high school, and I read the book Dibs in Search of Self. So here I am, 17 in high school, read the book and went, I want to do that. But when I did research on play therapy, and I'm 60. So like, we're talking a long time ago. There were no play therapy training programs in Canada. There wasn't even the American Association for Play Therapy at that point. But I knew from reading the book that if you're going to be you have to be a psychologist. Well, I knew from doing my research, you had to be great at math. And I moved around a lot as a kiddo, and math was just still not my best thing. So I knew that wasn't going to be it. So then I looked at what are the other professions that work with kiddos and look at child development, therapeutic activities, and mental wellness. And I also knew, because once my sister and I went home, my parents then had 7 more kids. So there was 9 of us, and they were foster parents. So we grew up with foster kids our whole life. And then my husband and I, a year into our marriage, became foster parents. So child welfare kind of was living, breathing in around. And So when I wanted to look for a program, it was like, what would be the program? And I actually had a guidance counselor who told me I should just go get a job because I probably wasn't smart enough to go to college or university.
Oh,
And I tell that story to students that I teach now to say, like, you can never look at a child and go determine their future. You just don't know where someone's going. So, but I did know myself well enough to know stats is not going to be a strength area for me. So I went and investigated a program, and the one that was closest in terms of connection was a child and youth care program. And Humber College had a 3-year program, the only one in Ontario that did at the time, with lots of practicum experiences. So I did that for a long, long time and worked in every like custody setting with kids, foster homes, group homes, community settings, schools. So I'd done all of those pieces. And then my husband and I were also foster parents. And somewhere around there, did trauma certification. And then was asked by the college would I like to come back and teach trauma? And I was like, for sure. So I was teaching a trauma class, and I was teaching some other classes. And one of my students came in it was a class on like issues or interventions in working with children and youth. And one of the students brought a sand tray in. And I was like, where did you get that?
wow.
And then she started talking about the Canadian Association for Play Therapy. And I was like,
What?
oh my gosh. So it was like full circle. So I then looked and went, okay, I'm doing the training. And my boss at the time was like, no, I can't lose you for that period of time, but next year you can go. So I did go, met Nancy Rail Bowers. I'd also been was halfway through a degree, full-time foster parent with complex kids, teaching and, working, right, and doing a lot of work. And I was doing, so I did at those days, the Canadian Association for Play Therapy, you could be a play therapy associate.
Yes.
So I was going to do that so I was in that program within a year in, fell in love with sand tray, went to the States for 6 years or 7 years to do my sand tray certification with Keith. And then bless Nancy Riddell Bowers, because Nancy said at the time in Ontario, the College of Psychotherapy was being birthed. And she said, when are you going to finish your bachelor's degree? And I was like, oh, so I really did everything backwards, right? I was like, I don't know. And she's like, oh, you really need to do that, Theresa. And I remember the last exam, I dropped roses on her front porch and said, thanks for pushing me, because I just needed someone to go, you can do this. And finished I didn't have many courses left, but I finished a bachelor's degree at Waterloo, and then applied and then at that point, it wasn't really clear nationally if we would actually need to have a master's level degree.
Right.
And then I was like, well, I'm on a roll, I might as well. So then I did my master's degree. And so really it's like, I've been very blessed with people that are not only supportive mentors, Nancy's been that to me. Betty Bedard Bidwell has always had an encouraging word, and she's like she's the mother of the Canadian Association for Play Therapy. I also had, because I was doing sand tray and was known for my trauma work, at one point I was asked to teach a class. I was teaching a workshop at the University of Wales in Wales, and I'll never forget, one of the persons, they leaned into me and they said, it'd probably be better if you don't use the word directive, because directive work was not a thing in those days. Everything was non-directive. And I said, okay, in trauma work, we do need to do some directive work. So what word do you want me to use? And the person said, focused. You could use the word focused. Okay, that's the word I'll use. So I did the presentation on integrating trauma work and play therapy. And the students had some amazing questions, like, how can we ethically work with someone when we're only going to get approval for 12 sessions?
Right.
Because in the UK at that time, there was no, like there wasn't time limited work or insurance work. You would see someone and you could see them for a long period of time. And I kind of argued, I was like, I think and that's the shift that I've seen. One of the shifts I've seen in the play therapy world, in that it's okay to do a piece of work. And I said, and the benefit at the time is, if you do that piece of work, and then you can also, at the end of the piece of work, do a report recommending what the next leg of the journey is going to be, because our responsibility always is, to be supporting those that we're privileged to walk alongside of, to see that therapy can be a lifelong process.
Yeah.
And with a different therapist, even. It doesn't have to be the same therapist. So I did that workshop, and then was co-presenting with someone at the British Association for Play Therapy. And one of the people from the university leaned in and said, "You must do your PhD with us." And I was kind of laughing and going, yeah, like, I'm not sure that's a far cry from a guidance counselor going, "You're probably not smart enough to go to college, university," right? So I am working through my PhD. I'll probably be done in a year. But I really have learned, in terms of mentorship, learned from people like we have such amazing Canadian supervisors and teachers like Nancy, Barbara Jones Warwick in London, who also teaches Santray. There's lots of people that have always been very encouraging and supportive to me. And I try to pay that forward with any of the students that come across my way too, because it's just like the kiddos we work with, the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
I had an associate say to me, who was a master's level student, she said, "So do you have a business plan?" And I laughed and said, "I should." That's the right way to do things. But I've always kind of made decisions in the play therapy world of, if the door is open, there's a reason. So go through the door.
Yes.
Like, just go through the door. So if someone invites you to, come do something, and even if you're not going to get paid, if you get a call from a supervisee that's like, "Can I just ask you a question?" For me, those are invitations.
Yeah.
And they always lead to something really interesting and exciting.
Right. So it all started, it started way back, but when you were saying that in high school you found dibs, like at the public library, like, where did you find that? At high?
I found it at the public library. Yeah, I was doing a book report for a English class, and I went, "Oh my gosh, I want to do that."
Okay.
And probably because I remembered going and seeing whoever, whether he was a psychiatrist or a psychologist, when I was a younger kiddo, and he had toys in the office, and I was like, "Oh, that's why that was there." Because I remember at the time thinking, what does a guy in a suit have toys in his office for? Like, what's that about? Yeah. So,
yeah, the power of those toys. Hey, like, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I would have been 6 or 7, maybe.
Right.
So that was a long time ago.
Meaningful to see those.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the same thing for the kiddos, like the kiddos that come into our office, and and the power of how they use things, like, is just mind-blowing always to me. I think I sit and watch and go, what a privilege this is, that we get to watch people's transformation as they're working it through in our office.
Right? Isn't it incredible?
It's just,
we have conversations like that here at my clinic as well. Just the privilege and the blessing of being able to watch these things unfold, and how wise children are.
Yeah.
And knowing what they need. Right.
Yeah. And then us being, often a question I'll get in when I'm doing Santray consultation will be, they're just doing the same thing all the time. And I'm like, and it may look like that, but then we need to look closer, because, and that's an interesting whole concept in our field, because there's some that talk about, kids are going to be in trauma play and you need to disrupt the play. And my mentor Gisela in Santray would say, no, there'll be a shift. If you're not seeing it, you got to look a little bit more closely.
I see.
And that's been my experience. It's like something shifts. And in the old days, when I learned Santray, we were using Polaroids.
Right.
Like, you were used, like, seriously, and it was costing a lot of money. And you'd always be like, and I was trained that you give a picture to a child and you keep one for the record. And now that we have digital photography, it's easier to see the shifts, because it's not just one photo at the end, because that's all you can afford to do. Now you can, and the kids know, they're like, "Can I use the camera?" And they will, if worlds are moving quickly, they'll use the camera, right? And then stop. And then if we pause and do like I do some EMDR while they're doing Santray, then we use the camera again to pause at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and shifts happen. They absolutely do happen, but are they on our schedule or the kids' schedule?
Right, right. And where's the pressure for those shifts, right?
Yeah.
This is kind of like a topic that's come up in previous interviews, right? The idea of like, trusting our model and like, sitting with the fact that sometimes we're just being there, we're just being with, waiting for those shifts,
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
incredible. Mhm.
Well, and I had a question because I have a colleague in Australia and we have a Santry certificate that we co-facilitate and we've done it for like 2 or 3 years. Yeah, about 3 years. And in our last last level, someone said, so how do you explain to the parents what's
Mhm.
happening when we're holding space and waiting for shifts to happen? And I was like, what a beautiful question that is, because it really then requires us also to make sure that we're doing psycho-ed front end, like come mom or dad or caregiver or grandparent, come in and let's do a Santry so you can experience the power of it.
Right.
And we can still be doing that non-directive work, whether it's Santry or something else in the play therapy room, and then doing parent consultation as well around whatever another issue is that's happening to support the parent, right?
Right.
With with their role in the treatment, because we all are part of the treatment plan and the treatment team. So we have to figure out how do we integrate all of those.
Yeah, for sure. Is that what you do in your practice? Sometimes bring the parent in to feel it?
Always.
Yeah.
When I do an intake, always it's like, would you like, because they see the miniatures.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've had it was so fun. I had one person once who came in and said, I really don't like that one. I feel like they're staring at me. And I was like, so where would you like to put them? And she said, seriously? And I was like, yeah, seriously. She said, can I just kind of turn her around so she's not watching me? And I was like, yeah, for sure. And then and I said, do that, turn her around. And then she came back and she said, I know why she was staring at me. And I said, well, we can talk about that, or I can also make a referral for you. She said, I think I want a referral. So I referred her to someone. Amazing. Because it brought something up for her.
Yeah. Yeah. The power of it. It's incredible. You have really, with all of your Santry training and experience and the training that you offer, it's not only, I'm thinking as we're talking, it's not only play therapy that you brought to the Eastern provinces, but you brought Santry.
Yeah.
Isn't that incredible?
Well, it's just so I think there have been I've heard from people over time that, at some point someone came here and did some Santry in Halifax. I'm in the northern zone, so I'm really I'm in between. I'm 2 hours from, about an hour and a half, 2 hours from Halifax, hour and a half, 2 hours from New Brunswick, hour and a half from Cape Breton. So I'm kind of smack in the middle. And, there have been people that have done bits and pieces, but nothing intensive.
Right.
And it catches on, like everything, it catches on. People are like, wow, because Santry, you can integrate it, as at being an EMDR consultant, with EMDR, I've integrated with brain spotting. I've used it in teaching. Like when I was a full-time professor, I would always teach the trauma classes as a trauma specialist, and I would always bring the Santry in, and we would have our final class. But I co-edited a book with one of my old Santry colleagues, Rita Grayson in the States, who has her own Santry training institute, and we co-edited a book last year. And we spent a lot of time during COVID meeting, and I said, there really is a difference in Santry between using Santry and doing Santry. So we made that distinction in the book, going, when you're doing Santry, it's the client is leading, you're journeying with them, you're following their lead, doing Santry. When you're using Santry, it's when we have a specific goal to say, can you build me a calm place in the Santry, or can you show me what it's like at mom's house compared to dad's house? And so I really see that distinction in terms of the directive work. And there's a lot of I find, like everywhere, there's a lot of teaching out there that's directive Santry, but a a little, sometimes not everybody's teaching the non-directive. And I think because it's uncomfortable, right? You don't know where that's going to go. And it may take more than 6 sessions. And how do you explain to people what you're doing when you're sitting with someone and waiting for shifts to happen?
Right. Yeah.
So that's, I think there was some people that were doing more directive, and there's now more people being more comfortable with client-centered or non-directive sanctuary.
Right. And both have such value when we're considering.
Yeah.
You mentioned the book. I read that book and it was so enjoyable to read. What is the title? Do you remember?
It's The Embodied Brain. The Embodied Brain in Sanctuary Therapy.
Right. And a lot of incorporation of neuroscience.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
And I'd like to say, like, I can't take credit for the editing. Rita Grayson is a phenomenal editor. She's just a phenomenal editor. And she's just a phenomenal editor. But there's some really lovely chapters in there from some Canadians, as well as was really happy to make sure we got some Canadian content in there, as well as Americans. But it's really nice. I like chapter books because you can do a little piece and someone can find something that fits with their practice. Sometimes in an edited book, when maybe other chapters aren't as relevant for them.
Right. And then the narrative aspect of it, the storytelling was sort of woven through. It was really remarkable, actually.
Oh, I'm so glad you liked it. I appreciated you saying, I read the book. I was like, that's so good.
I really liked it a lot, and I highly recommend it. So, out there where you are, I mean, you mentioned that, the remuneration for therapists is different than here in Ontario. I'm sure it varies across. I know that it varies out west as well. What is it like? I guess maybe just speaking to the issue of funding and budgets and those kinds of things that you face out there, and
I have to say it's gotten better in the last 6 months. How it went here was any therapist that was doing work for child welfare or victim services, or Mi'kmaq Child and Family, which is the Indigenous Child Welfare Agency, they had to be pre-vetted and on a list that the government creates themselves. So you have to be vetted by the government and on the list. And then anyone on the list were limited to charging $85 an hour. Wow. Didn't matter if you were fresh out of school or you had 30 years experience. It was $85 an hour. Yeah. So, and that's a problem. Because as we know, like master's degrees cost $30,000+ and our play therapy training, investment, supervision, rooms is very different than someone walking out of school and having 2 chairs and a coffee table in their office and providing service. So that has just in the 6 months changed. It was, I think, a big problem as well during Portapac. We had the biggest gun shooting mass. Mass event. See, I can't even say the words because it was such a big deal here. And we would hear from people over and over again that they couldn't access services. Because they could only get services from people that were on the list. Well, it also then makes it hard if you have specific trauma to find someone who is EMDR trained or, trained in brain spotting or other things, because how can people afford to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
And people that are working for publicly funded organizations, if they're making $45 an hour, they're lucky. So it's very different. So all of it's really different. So it's improved in the last 6 months. There is some change in that, but the other issue was, I'm being pretty political here. I'm just putting it on the table. Because I came from Ontario, I was a registered psychotherapist and I maintained my license because I want to supervise play therapists. And I hate people having to get a different supervisor for play therapy and licensure. It's much more affordable if it's all in one. Because, and again, when I got certified, it was 200 hours of play therapy supervision.
Right.
200 hours. It was a second mortgage on my house.
Yes.
That's what I
Yes.
did to pay for my
Yeah.
supervision. And now the association has decreased that, and it's in line with like regulatory colleges across the country, which is fantastic. But so I'm a registered psychotherapist. There's many insurance companies here that will pay for registered psychotherapy, but they won't pay for registered counseling therapists.
I see.
But the college that's in the Maritimes is counseling therapy. Why is that?
Wow.
Yeah, why is that? I think it's
That is,
because many of the insurance companies are head officed in Ontario, and it's to their benefit not to provide reimbursement for counseling therapists.
I see.
So I don't have a problem, but I know a lot of my supervisees have a problem, which is really frustrating. It's changing. The local teachers federation or teachers union just changed their insurance to include RCTs, and that's a huge win. And I think over time it will change. But if I put RP on an invoice, that's very different than RCT.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
that's not okay.
No, it really isn't. You're right. Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
It's not okay.
Wow. Huh. There's so many
Yeah.
restrictions, hey?
There's
Like,
lots of restrictions, and it makes it hard to be supporting people. And I think also, with the fact that play therapy is growing and people now are saying, I want a play therapist for my client or my child. That's why we're really working hard at educating people on what does it take to do it. It isn't just, you just read a book and go, oh, I'm a play therapist now, or have some toys in my office. And it isn't just the education. It's also supervised practice with a supervisor like yourself, and then practice. So the community is growing, and they're very passionate, and they're feisty, which I really like.
which is amazing. It's
Because we
just,
have to speak up, right?
yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for sharing all that. The climate, the landscape, the different provinces that we have here in Canada, they look so different. And so that really highlights some of the issues that people out there that want to be play therapists or are training to be play therapists are might struggle with. I'm wondering if you could speak to the phrase "play is the voice of the child."
Oh yeah. I almost don't want to. I almost don't want to speak to it. I would like to say, let's watch it. Let's look at it. Let's show it. But I have lots of examples, as I'm sure you do and listeners do, of children showing us, Paris Goodyear Brown, who has her TED Talk on play and I feel privileged to call her friend. I really love in that TED Talk when she says, I'm going to show you a little, and then I'm going to show you more. And play does that, where kiddos will show a little to show you what they're experiencing, what their view is, and it's like, can you handle it? Can you hold it? Can you wait without making an assumption or talking? Can you just be there with me? And then if you can do that, then I can show you the next little bit. But we have to make sure, just like with Santray, I say to Santray students, like, it's so easy to look at a miniature that's used and assume you know what it is.
Right.
Whether it's a child or an adult. And I always tell a story in training where I was doing a workshop for foster parents on, what is play therapy, because many of their kiddos were going to play therapy. And there was a new supervisor that was just hired, and he was going to be the resource person for this group of people. And the last one was an amazing guy. Like, they just loved him. I loved him too. Like, he salted the earth. He's good in a crisis. He was, really experienced, and he was kind of passing the baton to this other person who was lovely, but younger and fresh out of school. So I did an experience with them all where we were using the Santray, where I said, can you each pick a miniature that reflects a passion that or a value you have about being a foster parent and doing this work. And we, with silence, we're not going to talk. And then I said, and now we get to go around a second time, and you can add a miniature, take a miniature out, or move someone's miniature. because I was hoping we were going to get into a conversation around boundaries and communication. And this particular person, I was a deer and he was a polar bear. And your listeners can't see, but I've raised my hands over like and embodied the polar bear. And he took the deer and laid the deer down in the sand, and the whole room went, oh. And I didn't say anything because I'm facilitating, and we waited, and then we went around again, and then we finished, and then we were debriefing. People talked about, what their miniature meant to them. And it was a very teary experience, which happens in Santray, as we know, because it really hits our brain in ways we're not doing frontal cortex work.
Yeah.
And then we get to this individual, and I said, so I'm wondering, and he said, you're wondering about the deer? And I was like, yeah. And he said, the polar bear wanted the deer to know that it could lay down and it would stand over and protect it. And then everybody went, oh. Yeah, like,
oh my gogosh, that is
you can sleep. You can sleep and I'll stand over and protect you. It gives me goosebumps even thinking about it.
Yeah, me too.
And then as he was walking me to the car, I said, that was powerful. And I probably saved you about 3 months of transition work with those people, because you got them now, like they trust you. Yeah. And he was like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, because, what do? We apply our own fears, values, beliefs onto other people and onto even toys is the danger. And it was about, if we're looking at that, we could look at the bear was putting the deer down to be aggressive, because they're fearful about the power dynamic. Right. And yet you cut through all that to say, no, you can rest and I got your back. Like I got you.
Wow. Incredible.
Yeah. And that was adults playing, right? So, play, if we're noticing and we're watching and we're really, I think the hardest skill as a clinician, as well as a play therapist, is to sit in the discomfort of not knowing.
Yes. Yeah.
And be okay with not knowing, and just being and
waiting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And trusting that the wait, it's going to happen when it happens. Right. If we can kind of work through that, then of course you have those thoughts that go through our minds always, where it's like, I'm getting paid to do this and I'm sitting here, and what should I be doing? And maybe I should say something next. And how am I going to write this up in a report? And we just have to always, as all of my, and they were coming full circle to the beginning of the conversation, all of my mentors would say to me, trust the process. Nancy would say, trust the process. Gisela would say, trust the process, that it's going to be what it needs to be. And if we're going to be the relational holder of the space, it'll become clear to us. And sometimes it won't, but we trust that it is for the child, and that's more important than us. So
yeah, it is. Thank you so much for that. That was just worded so well. All my thoughts in those sentences you just said. So the last question I have here, just for our listeners, you have such experience and so much wisdom when it comes to all of these models.
Yeah, I feel like I'm still learning.
I know, isn't it? It's such a weird thing. Hey,
it's the push and pull of learning.
There's so much to learn in human beings. But you mentioned some words of advice for new clinicians to trust the process. Is there anything else that you would say to people that are listening that have just been trained or interested in becoming trained in play therapy?
Find a supervisor that you really feel comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And then you can, and sometimes also find a therapist.
Yes.
In other countries, it's a requirement that play therapists get their own therapy. Like in Britain and Australia, you have to have your own therapy. In Canada, we don't have that requirement. In the US, there is not that requirement, but there's going to be times when our own stuff gets stirred up and we need to be really clear that it's our stuff. So be okay with doing that. But I mean, culturally, from a helper perspective, it's more socially acceptable to do that. I remember working, and I tell this to students, in classes that I teach sometimes, where I remember working at a residential treatment center, and one of the staff got fired because the manager saw that they had an antidepressant medication in their bag. and the person had to acknowledge that they had a diagnosed mental health issue.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
But that was in the 80s and it was a thing. Like, so we've come so far from not being able to acknowledge that we're less than perfect humans and that we have our own stuff. And COVID, I think, brought that out as well. That
Absolutely.
I love Brené Brown's work where she talks about you got to be vulnerable to heal, and relationships get stronger when we're real with each other. So if ever there's times when you feel like you need to get your own support, do that, and find a supervisor that not only makes you feel smart, but also challenges you, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
have you thought of this? And what about doing this and that? Nancy was like, I did the bulk of my individual supervision with Nancy Riddell Bowers, and she did say to me something that I didn't listen to, and it's probably better wisdom that I should have listened in some ways, but she said, you know, you'll find your thing and then you'll focus on that thing. And I've struggled with that thing because there's, but I realized it in November when I was sitting with Anna Gomez at a training, and she talked about the house, like you got to find your house. And I was like, it was like light bulbs went on for me. And it's like, the house is trauma for me. It was trauma before play therapy. It's trauma after. And if we're going to work with trauma, then we're going to use the therapeutic approach that fits developmentally where the person's at that stage, which means for some, it's going to be non-directive child-centered play therapy. Others, it's going to be Sandtray. Others, it might be EMDR integrated with Sandtray or play therapy. So there's so much out there. And I think what Nancy was trying to tell me was we can't do it all.
Right.
Like you got to find your focus. And I feel like sometimes I have lots of focuses happening at the same time, but I think it's really wise to not feel like you have to do it at all and just focus on, you know, getting your supervision and getting your education and being with people that will support your learning in practice.
Right.
And then it will become clear to you what the next thing needs to be that you're going to integrate with what you're doing.
Yeah, it will.
That is.
For sure. I can concur with that for sure.
And then networking, like it's really important because we work so much in isolation. You know, I have, I think the students out of my first two cohorts, they still meet together and do peer consultation.
That's lovely.
Like monthly, because, and they all talk about how it's changed their practice because it's wonderful to be around other people that get it when they're in practices with adults. Adult therapists are like, why do you have so much stuff in your office?
Right.
Anyway, yeah. So those are my little pearls of wisdom.
Thank you so much, Theresa. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, I was so happy to have the conversation with you. And I appreciate doing work with you on the play therapy committee, and I hope we'll do that for play therapy
I'm so excited.
next year. And yeah, like I smile when I hear about your work, because I still hear about your work from other people. Well, like when I started in Cambridge, I was the only one. Like it was one little clinic, and now there's you, and I know there's probably 5 or 6 other people doing amazing work, and it just makes my heart sing, because that's how play therapy grows across the country.
It does. Yeah. Yeah. And promoting that love, right? The love of play therapy and the process of play therapy and just getting it out there is so important. So there's a lot of kids that could use it. So
yeah. And adults.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Thank you
so much. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Okay. Have a good day. Bye.
This podcast was proudly brought to you by the Purple Butterfly Healing Center in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada. For more information about the Purple Butterfly Healing Center and child and play therapy, please visit our website at www.purplebutterfly.ca.